Okay, I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 27 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, December 13th, 2021. The committee is resuming its study of the use and impact of facial recognition technology, and I would like to now welcome our witnesses from the American Civil Liberties Union, Asha Bandari, and from the Samuelson Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, Tamir Israel, staff lawyer. So my apologies to those for the late start. It was just a function, once again, not uncommon at this time of year of the timing of votes in the House of Commons. The meeting was scheduled for 1 hour from 3:30 to 4:30. We will still go ahead for the full hour starting now. So with that, I will ask Ms. Bandari to begin. You have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for the invitation. My name is Asha Bandari, and I am a Deputy Director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project based in New York, originally from St. John, New Brunswick. I'd like to speak to the committee about the dangers of biometric identifiers with a specific focus on facial recognition. Because biometric identifiers are personally identifying and generally immutable, biometric technologies, including face recognition, pose severe threats to civil rights and civil liberties by enabling privacy violations, including the loss of anonymity in contexts where people have traditionally expected it, including enabling persistent tracking of movement and activity, and identity theft. Additionally, flaws in the use or operation of biometric technologies can lead to significant civil rights violations, including false arrests and denial of access to benefits, goods, and services, as well as employment discrimination. All of these problems have been shown to disproportionately affect racialized communities. So, what exactly are we talking about with biometrics? Prior to the digital age, collection of limited biometrics like fingerprints were laborious and slow. Now we have the potential for near instantaneous collection of biometrics, including face prints. We have machine learning capabilities and digital age network technologies. So all of these technological advances combined make the threat of biometric collection even greater than it was in the past. Face recognition is, of course, an example of this, but I want to highlight that voice recognition, iris or retina scans, DNA collection, gait and keystroke recognition are also examples of biometric technology that have effects on civil liberties. Facial recognition allows for instant identification at a distance without knowledge or consent of the person being identified and tracked. And even in the past, identifiers that needed to be captured with the knowledge of the person, such as fingerprints, can now be collected without the knowledge of the person, which includes DNA that we shed as we go about our daily lives. Iris scans can be done remotely, and facial recognition and face prints can be collected remotely without the knowledge or consent of the person whose biometrics are being collected. Facial recognition is particularly prone to the flaws of biometrics, which include design flaws, hardware limitations, and other problems. Multiple studies have shown that face recognition algorithms have markedly higher misidentification rates for people of color, including Black people, women, children, and older adults. There are many reasons for this. I won't get into the specifics of that, but in part it's because of the data sets that are used, but also flaws in real-world conditions. And I also want to highlight that often the error rates that are shown in test conditions are exacerbated in real-world conditions, which are often worse than test conditions. So, for example, if a facial recognition tool is being used on poor quality surveillance footage. There's also other risks with face recognition technology, and that is when it is combined with other technology to infer emotion, cognitive state, or intent. We see private companies increasingly promoting products that purport to detect emotion or affect, such as aggression detectors, based on facial tics, or other movements that this technology picks up on. Psychologists who study emotion agree that this project is built on faulty science because there's no universal relationship between emotional states and observable facial traits. But nonetheless, these video analytics are proliferating, claiming to detect suspicious behavior or detect lies, and when deployed in certain contexts can cause real harm, including employment discrimination. If private companies use these tools to analyze someone's face during an interview, infer emotion or truthfulness, and deny jobs based on this technology. I've been speaking, of course, about the flaws with the technology and the error rates that it has, which again disproportionately fall on certain marginalized communities. But there are, of course, problems even when the facial recognition technology functions and functions accurately. The ability for law enforcement, for example, to systematically track people and their movements over time poses a threat to freedom and civil liberties. Sensitive movements can be identified, whether people are traveling to protests, to medical facilities, other sensitive locations. In recognition of these dangers from law enforcement use, at least 23 jurisdictions in the United States, from Boston to Minneapolis to San Francisco to Jackson, Mississippi, have enacted legislation halting law enforcement or government use of face recognition technology. There's also, of course, the private sector use of this technology, which I just want to highlight. Again, we see trends now where, for example, landlords may be using facial recognition technology in buildings, which enables them to track their tenants' movements in and out of the building, and also guests, romantic partners, and others who come in and out of the building. And we also see this use in private shopping malls and in other contexts.
Ms. Bandari, I'm sorry to have to interrupt you, but I will ask you to just in the next couple of seconds wrap up so that we can carry on. You are a little bit over time.
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to conclude with a couple policy recommendations. One, government use of facial recognition technology should be prohibited, law enforcement use, but at the very least, there has to be regulation to constrain its use and protect individuals from the harm that can result. And that same regulation should extend to private entities that use facial recognition technology. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. And thank you. And with that, then we go to Mr. Israel for up to 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Tamir Israel, and I'm a lawyer with the Samuelson Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic at the University of Ottawa, which sits on traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this important study into facial recognition systems. As the Commission has heard, facial recognition technology is versatile and poses an insidious threat to privacy and anonymity while undermining substantive equality. It demands a societal response that's different and more proactive than other forms of surveillance technology. Face recognition is currently distinguished by its ability to operate surreptitiously and at a distance. Pre-authenticated image databases can also be compiled without participation from individuals, and this has made facial recognition the biometric of choice for achieving a range of tasks. In its current state of development, the technology is accurate enough to inspire confidence in its users, but sufficiently error-prone that mistakes will continue to occur with potentially devastating consequences. We have long recognized, for example, that photo lineups can lead police to fixate erroneously on particular suspects. Automation bias compounds this problem exponentially. When officers using an application such as Clearview AI or searching a mugshot database are presented with an algorithmically generated gallery of 25 potential suspects matching a grainy image taken from a CCTV camera, the tendency is to defer to the technology and presume the right person has been found. Simply including human supervision will therefore never be sufficient to fully mitigate the harms of this technology. And of course, racial bias remains a significant problem for facial recognition systems as well. Even for top-rated algorithms, false matches can be 20 times higher for Black women, 50 times higher for Native American men, and 120 times higher for Native American women than for white men. This persistent racial bias can render even mundane uses of facial recognition deeply problematic. For example, a United Kingdom government website relies on face detection to vet passport image quality, providing an efficient mechanism for online passport renewal. But the face detection algorithm often fails for people of color, and this alienates individuals who are already marginalized by locking them out of conveniences available to others. As my friend Ms. Mandari mentioned, even when facial recognition is cured of its biases and errors, though, the technology remains deeply problematic. Facial recognition uses deeply sensitive biometric information and provides a powerful identification capability that we know from other investigative tools, such as street checks, will be used disproportionately against Indigenous, Black, and other marginalized communities. So far, facial recognition systems can and have been used by Canadian police on an arrested suspect's mobile device photo album, on CCTV footage in the general vicinity of crimes, and on surveillance photos taken by police in public spaces. At our borders, facial recognition is at the heart of an effort to build sophisticated digital identities. Your face will be your passport is becoming an all too common refrain. That technology also provides a means of linking these sophisticated identities and other digital profiles to individuals, driving an unprecedented level of automation. At all stages, transparency is an issue, as government agencies in particular are able to adopt and repurpose facial recognition systems surreptitiously, relying on dubious lawful authorities and without any advanced public license. We join many of our colleagues in calling for a moratorium on public safety and national security related uses of facial recognition and on new uses at our borders. Absent a moratorium, we would recommend amending the criminal code to limit law enforcement use to investigations of serious crimes and in the absence of reasonable grounds to believe. A permanent ban on the use of automated live biometric recognition by police in public spaces would also be beneficial. And we would also recommend exploring a broader prohibition on the adoption of new facial recognition capabilities by federal bodies, absent some sort of explicit legislative or regulatory approval. Substantial reform of our two core federal privacy laws is also required. Now, Bill C-27 was tabled this morning and enacts would enact the Artificial Intelligence Act, as well as reform our private sector law, federal law PIPEDA. Those reforms are pending and will be explored. But in both, beyond the amendments in Bill C-27, both PIPEDA and the Privacy Act need to be amended so that biometric information is explicitly encoded as sensitive, requires greater protection in all contexts, and under PIPEDA requires express consent in all contexts. Both PIPEDA and the Privacy Act should also be amended to legally require companies and government agencies to file impact assessments with the Privacy Commissioner prior to adopting intrusive technologies. And finally, the Commissioner should be empowered to interrogate intrusive technologies through a public regulatory process and to put in place usage limitations or even moratoria where necessary. Those will be my opening remarks, and I thank the committee for its time and look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you. And for the first round, up to 6 minutes, Mr. Kurek.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today. And as I often start, please do feel free to follow up with specific recommendations. Certainly, that is valuable in when it comes time for this committee to put together its report. I appreciate the content of your opening statements, and one of the biggest challenges I think that lawmakers have and public policy makers have in terms of addressing this issue is trying to find that right balance, because you'll have law enforcement that says we need every tool available to help fight crime, to help protect victims, etc. But on the other side, we have there's the valid argument of saying we need to ensure that vulnerable people groups are protected, that there is that the Canadians, in the case of Canada, our rights are respected. So I'd ask this question to both. Do you have any recommendations for this committee as to how to find that right balance? So start with Mr. Israel.
I would say that when you're talking about an intrusive technology like this, the onus is on the government to make its case for the use of this technology. One of the biggest problems is that currently, and I know the committee has heard this, but currently adoption happens at the ground level, and any legislative response comes in response to that. Some of our recommendations would flip that around by either creating a legislative obligation to go to the legislature and make the case for the use of some of these techniques in advance, or alternatively empower the regulator, the Independent Privacy Commissioner of Canada, to play a proactive role in assessing and approving or disapproving elements of these technologies. So I think that might be one kind of meta consideration for how to address some of these challenges more broadly, and
Okay.
that we think so.
Thank you. And Ms. Bandari, did I say that right?
Yes. Just to follow up on Mr. Israel, and I would say I agree that the onus, when we're talking about a new technology, particularly one with as many flaws as facial recognition, the onus has to be on law enforcement. But in this case, we know the flaws. Multiple studies have shown the disproportionate error rates and the consequential impacts on people's lives. There have been a few high-profile instances in the United States of Black men being falsely arrested by a facial recognition match, and the devastating consequences for people because of that. So at the very least, extensive study to show that those flaws and error rates have been eliminated, that there aren't disproportionate impacts on people based on demographic, and that's just not there now. And in the absence of that, essentially, the widespread use of facial recognition technology in these specific contexts is running an experiment on the population at large, and so we're not there yet. But certainly looking forward, I'd also agree that the concerns about persistent tracking, identity theft, all of those exist. So any balance that this committee strikes in its recommendation has to take into account that the harms that will result even if the technology functions as it's claimed to function.
Thank you for that, and a little bit of a follow-up on that, Ms. Bandari. This committee had studied the usage of mobility data in terms of Canada's public health response to COVID-19, and it was interesting. During your opening statement, I heard some consistency in the remarks that you shared to some of the concerns that this committee heard over the course of that previous study. I'm wondering if you have any observations, if you had a chance to at all see the work that this committee did. Was there anything that you'd like to add to that?
There's definitely, I think, a tie-in to those concerns because location tracking is one of the harms from even properly functioning facial recognition. It's a society in which every move we make is in a database to be used. So I think the concerns about mobile tracking and contact tracing when they come without those safeguards are the same for facial recognition. And again, we don't currently live in a society where we, regardless of whether we're out in public, expect that our every move, and the technology is there to track you everywhere you go all day long, that would be accessible to government, to law enforcement, and to private companies potentially that want to market to you or exploit you in some way. So location tracking concerns that this committee considered previously are also applicable here.
And I appreciate that. And one final question in my last minute. We often hear the example of Clearview AI, and we've heard how that's no longer used in Canada, no longer contracted by law enforcement. But certainly there's a whole host of other providers and some further applications that may not be as directly have as direct of purpose as Clearview AI. I'm wondering if you would share with the committee your experience with maybe other providers or other examples that this committee should maybe be aware of. There's about 30 seconds left.
There are certainly other providers, and Clearview, that we've also settled, the American Civil Liberties Union has settled with Clearview in the United States to limit their, selling their database to private entities in the United States. But that's one company among many, and many of the companies are not necessarily consumer facing. So they won't be the big tech names that people are aware of, which again, transparency is so key because the public may not know of these companies the way they know of big social media, for example.
Thank you.
Sachs for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses here today. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Israel, if I may. In September 2020, the Samuel Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic released a report, which you wrote on facial recognition, and it focuses primarily on borders and its use at borders. So I'd like you, in sort of a very specific, because of time, fashion, what were the main findings of the report? If you give like the top three. And then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, so I would say the main findings were that facial recognition is being adopted at the border without really due consideration for the harms that it would cause, without much oversight, external oversight, often without regard to existing policies like the Treasury Board's policy on regulate on that's where you're supposed on artificial intelligence, where you're supposed to bring in external guidance when adopting intrusive technologies like that. And then once it's adopted, it often gets repurposed very quickly for reasons beyond the narrow reasons in the context it was developed. I think, and then the last one was that it often provides a link between digital and physical presences in ways that allow for automation and the application of many other automated assessment tools, which is problematic in and of itself.
You made in your opening remarks that human interaction with these platforms is insufficient. We've actually heard from other witnesses that human interaction is an imperative part of being able to utilize this technology. So could you clarify on that a little bit, please?
I agree it's an integral part, but it's important to also recognize that it's not enough, because the way that, and we heard from, I think this committee heard from a witness as well on how humans interact with facial images that they're presented as well, and have their own biases creep in. But the example that I provided of a photo lineup that is often used by police and replicates the type of image output that you often get from a facial recognition system, where it gives you like the top maybe 10 or 15 matches. We know that as an investigative tool that has led to a lot of problems in the past for police, and that is the type of human this supervision that we're talking about. And it's worse in the context of facial recognition systems, because the tendency is to trust in the automated results of the system, so that they produced an accurate match, and to really so you're questioning it even less than in the context where you're getting just a general photo lineup and trying to figure out who a person is.
All right.
So what it ends up doing is embedding biases and cognitive and other biases. Yeah,
I understand. You know, there is an element of human error in everything in life, but I think what I'm asking, my next question on that is, if we move to a legislative guardrails on this, can you actually legislate for human error? You know, can we legislate for human intervention? But how do we legislate for human error then in the train has left the station on these technologies, and you know, we're trying to look at what would the guardrails be. So can we legislate human error, really?
I think you can legislate. I think legislating a human in the decision-making loop is an important thing to include. I just think it's also important to recognize that it doesn't solve all the problems, as it's often presented as the solution. So often you're still going to have a lot of bias problems even with a human involved in the investigation. So beyond that, you still need more. We still recommend moratoria given the wide potential for harm with this particular technology until we get to a better and more concrete regulatory and technologically developed state.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm going to move to Ms. Bandari, if I may. I'd like to touch on something that unfortunately we didn't get to enough of in this study in terms of location tracking technologies that's used in commercial and retail spaces. For example, Cadillac Fairview here is a big mall owner in Canada, and they tend to have cameras and other technologies in their spaces, from what I understand. You know, we talk a lot about the legislation in terms of the relationship of private companies with law enforcement, but what are your thoughts? I'll start with you, Bandari, but perhaps also Mr. Israel, on how do we legislate on that private-commercial relationship with these types of technologies going forward? And, you know, in an ideal world, if there was a moratorium and we had time to think about this.
Before Ms. Bandari, you respond to Ms. Sack's question, I would ask you to perhaps move the boom on your microphone up a little bit. We had a little bit of trouble with your audio. Okay, well, let's go ahead, and I'll stop you again if we need another adjustment.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I hope this is better. Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Go ahead.
To address the question on private sector use, the harms are real, and I'll highlight a few examples. So in Michigan, for example, a skating rink was using a facial recognition tool on customers that were coming in and out. And a 14-year-old black girl was ejected from the skating rink after the face recognition system incorrectly matched her to a photo of someone who was suspected of previously disrupting the rink's business. We've seen private businesses use this type of technology, whether it's concert venues or stadiums, sports venues, to identify people on a blacklist for whatever reason, customers that they don't want to allow back in. And again, the error, the risk of error and the dignitary harms involved with that, the denial of service is very real, but also the fact that this tracking information is now potentially in the hands of private companies, which may have widely varying security practices. We've also seen examples of security breaches where large facial recognition databases held by both government or private companies have been revealed in public. And because these face prints are immutable, it's not like a credit card number, which you can change once your biometrics are out there and potentially used for identity purposes. That's a risk. Similarly, we've seen some companies, for example, Walgreens in the United States, is now deploying face recognition technology that can pick out a customer's age and gender and show them tailored ads or other products. This is also an invasive practice that could lead to concerns about shoppers and consumers being steered to discounts or products based on gender stereotypes, further segregating our society, and even more consequentially,
I'm sorry to have to do it again, but you're a fair bit over. We are a fair bit over time on this round, so I'm going to
thank you.
Go next to Monsieur Villemeux pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bandari, good afternoon. I have a few questions for you. You know, this committee has heard all kinds of horror stories and error stories, things that happen. We heard about bias, prejudice, especially with racialized populations. I understand that your association is an association of defense of rights, so an activist association. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate. Is there an advantage to facial recognition?
I agree with what Mr. Israel said earlier, that the onus and the burden should be on the entities seeking to use facial recognition. Now, certainly, I think private companies would say there's an advantage. They're making money off of it. Collecting data, as we know, is very profitable. I don't think that that's an advantage that this committee should consider when weighed against the invasion of rights. When we're talking about law enforcement and government uses, I think it's true that new technology will always be claimed to be solving age-old problems, but I don't see any evidence that the use of facial recognition technology and any perceived benefits it might bring to law enforcement outweighs the type of transformation it would render in society.
Donc, selon votre perspective, l'atteinte au droit est tellement importante que le bénéfice, d'ailleurs commercial, parce que ce n'est pas notre visée en effet, là, mais que le bénéfice, souvent commercial, ne vaut pas la peine. C'est une trop grande atteinte au droit. D'accord? C'est bien ça? Vous avez parlé des emotions detectors un peu plus tôt. On a entendu dans le passé des
emotions detector earlier. I read some studies that are frivolous, but to be able to recognize sexual preferences, political preferences with facial recognition. Is something that's possible, that's in the future, or is it a complete fantasy?
There are a lot of companies right now marketing the ability to do this. The science is not there to support it. Currently, all the experts say that there's not a reliable link between our physical or biological manifestations and those mental states or propensities. But I think the real fear, of course, is that society will come to accept these links, that we'll, go back to an age where we thought, physiognomy or physical characteristics revealed character, and that this new technology will be seen as providing new and objective truth. So I'm not sure that the fear is that it will, in fact, reveal mental states, but the concern is that it is being marketed as such.
Car je vais faire du pouce sur votre dernier.
So I'm going to follow on what you've just said. Should the population now get used to surveillance? Is it not maybe a lost cause to try to legislate all the millions of images that are already circulating, or billions of images?
It is absolutely not a lost cause, and there is plenty of time for the government to take action. regulating the flow of information going forward is critical to putting a halt to some of the harms we've seen. It's not inevitable that we continue to be awash in biometric information, that we continue to be tracked. What's come before, of course, has come before, but moving forward, we can put guardrails in place, we can have strong laws and regulations. Just because an industry has been unregulated in the past doesn't mean it's too late to solve it now.
Utiliser, c'est du contenu fourni par l'utilisateur.
So you're using content that's supplied by the user, so there should be some kind of education done about the risks related to the use of this.
Of it. I also want to highlight, though, that oftentimes data is collected from people without their consent. So many people who use the internet to shop, to search for information, don't know how they're being tracked. As I mentioned, face prints being captured are often captured without our consent. Nobody meaningfully can say no if surveillance cameras are gathering that. So this is not a problem of people willingly giving up their biometrics. Most of the time, people don't know, which is why a knowledge and consent requirement before biometrics are captured is very critical.
Vous pourriez en quelques minutes nous parler.
Could you speak about the lawsuit that you won against Clearview?
Yes, we filed a lawsuit against Clearview under an Illinois state law known as BIPA, the Biometric Information Privacy Act. And we settled that lawsuit. Under the terms of the settlement, there are two key provisions. Clearview can no longer provide access to its database containing millions and millions of face prints nationwide to any private entity permanently. So it's a permanent ban on selling to private entities in the country with a few exceptions, and a 5-year ban on law enforcement access within Illinois. The only way we were able to bring this lawsuit is because Illinois has a Biometric Information Privacy Act, which, it makes it rare in the United States, and that law shows the potential of regulation. That law is what enabled us to sue Clearview and to reach the settlement where Clearview can no longer sell its face print technology to private entities around the country.
Les quelques secondes qui me restent, je vous demande.
In my remaining few seconds, could you please send us documentation on this law? On this case also, that would be very good. And also, by curiosity, Clearview can sell this outside of the US at this point?
It doesn't address anything they do outside the United States.
Okay.
That's correct.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Next will be Mr. Green for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you. And I'd like to pick up on that. I could recall coming back through an international flight and being herded through an American Homeland Security checkpoint. I believe it was in Pearson, and the first time, having to contemplate iris scans. I'm wondering if the witnesses can speak, and perhaps we can start with Ms. Bandari, about the way in which Nexus in our airports has her work in the States led to any investigations or research on Nexus's kind of public-private biodata collection service?
One of the areas that we have been concerned about is the expansion of facial recognition and other biometric technology in airports. So we haven't looked specifically at Nexus, but the same principle holds with, for example, global entry, the global entry system in the United States. And the concern, of course, is as people become required to provide face prints or iris scans to access essential services, going to the airport, crossing the border, entering a government building, it facilitates a checkpoint society, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And these are not contexts in which people can meaningfully opt out. So one clear area of regulation could be providing people with a meaningful opt-out. Saying that, if you don't want to prove your identity via an iris scan, we provide you the option to do so another way, with your passport, for example, with your Nexus card, for example. So the airport use and the border use, because it's such a coercive environment, because people don't have the choice to walk away, that's been a big concern.
Mr. Israel?
Yeah, so exactly what Ms. Bandari was saying. It's a big problem because programs like Nexus are opt-in a sense, but the pressure to get through the border and the explicit use of the border as a pain point to encourage travelers to sign up for these types of systems is a problem. Canada, for example, piloted a program with the Netherlands, which was developed by the World Economic Forum, and it's basically a digital identity that's housed on your phone that has a lot of your passport information and additional like social identity verification program information. And the idea was to see if that could be used as in replacement of a passport to facilitate border crossings. And facial recognition was the technology that was built into that system. And the end vision of that system, and it's very explicit, is that you would get travelers to voluntarily sign up for this to avoid the delays at the border, because it gives you access to faster security processing. But then it later becomes available to banks, telecommunication companies, and other entities as well for similar identity verification programs.
Oh boy, Mr. Israel, I think you might have just touched a third rail when you talked about World Economic Forum in this context. But I do have an interest in, in your report when you talked about how some of the evidence suggests that Canadian border control agencies appear to be unaware of racial biases inherent in these systems. And what little public information is available suggests that these capabilities may have been assessed for general levels of inaccuracy, and they've not been assessed for racial bias. And I referenced that into the ongoing saga of the no-fly lists for kids. We literally in this country have children who have been flagged and identified and put on no-fly lists because they might have Muslim-sounding names or are caught up in some kind of bureaucratic nightmare, quite frankly, with trying to travel. So can you just talk about the risks that the lack of awareness of racial bias poses, particularly when we talk about having human guardrails in place to be able to help offset some of these inconsistencies and inaccuracies?
Certainly. So that is it's a very, very, very valid and salient concern. The no-fly lists have been a long-standing problem. And there have been proposals to create facial recognition enabled lists of with comparable objectives. CBSA did, in fact, pilot one for a while and decided, I think, not to implement it yet, but it is something that they piloted, and that's deeply problematic. More recent, the response from CBSA has been concerning. For example, one CBC report that tried to probe into the racial biases in one of their facial recognition systems, when they asked for more detailed breakdowns of error rates and racial bias rates. First, it appeared through access to information requests that CBSA was not aware at the time of their adoption that these were real, and then later on, the response was that there's a national security concerns with providing this type of error data, which is just not. There's in other jurisdictions this is publicly available. In other jurisdictions it's required to be publicly available by law. It's just that's not a good approach. More recently, there has been some very quickly developments in the sense that CBSA has announced it will try to implement a biometric study hub within its infrastructure, but we haven't really seen what's going in.
Before my round wraps up, I think about the nightmare that is Toronto Pearson, the 3-4 hour long waits for domestic travel because security lanes are closed. Do you think that this is the right preconditions for filtering people into things like Nexus? I know when I'm standing in line and I look at the business class or Visa or the Nexus lines, which are empty, do you think that the inconsistencies and the inefficiencies of our borders might result in a peak of people applying for things like Nexus?
I think it really is putting people in an unfair position to choose that that's the only way that they can make their airport travel experience a little bit more unpleasant, a little less unpleasant, I should say. The direction that things are going is worse. Like there's proposals around the world to automate that streaming process, where like you'll walk up to basically a screen, you'll get a facial recognition scan. There'll be an assessment of your profile that gets pulled in digitally, and then you'll get automatically through gates channeled to like a high security, medium security, a low security line, and that will just be this on steroids. So And again, like if you don't have the right profile in place to interact
I
with
can
this,
imagine where this is headed. I've been pulled out into secondary more than my fair share of time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to the witnesses.
Thank you. And that was, we went quite a bit over time there, but it's, I let it go. We were getting good information, and hopefully we'll try and keep our rounds tight to time there. So with that, next we have Mr. Bragdon. Welcome to our committee, and you have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and greetings to all the other committee members here today. And it's an important, very important subject we're covering. And obviously, I think a lot of Canadians have genuine concerns when they consider this, and sincere concerns. And as our world continues to change at such a rapid pace, and we're seeing concerns about privacy continue to be risen, obviously balanced with the need for security for populations. I think Canadians are certainly wanting to be assured that all the safeguards are put in here as possible to protect individual rights and privacy rights of Canadians. Mr. Israel, I'll go to you first, as your report makes several other interesting recommendations when it comes to what you would like to see in a legislative framework for facial recognition technology, which of course we do not currently have. In your report, you write the need for legislative backing applies to border control implementations that rely on a form of consent, such as an opt-out or an opt-in. Do you believe all use of facial recognition technology by border control should have an opt-in, opt-out component?
Yes, part of the problem with the technology is if there's not an explicit opt-in requirement, you're not even necessarily aware that you're being subjected to the technology. So, for example, the customs clearing screening mechanisms that they have at Pearson, from the traveler experience, you don't even necessarily realize you're being facially recognition, like that a facial recognition scan is happening, because there is no explicit obligation to get your consent. That's deeply problematic. In the U.S., we saw examples where there was an obligation to provide an opt-out, but the signs were like hidden in the corner. People didn't see them very well. So yeah, I would say like requiring at the very least an opt-out and very clear notification, and perhaps even an opt-in would be a useful addition.
Can you further explain the difference between centralized and decentralized architecture in facial recognition technology, and how it is susceptible to breaches in each type of system? What breaches they may be susceptible to? Can you explain that for us a bit?
Yeah. So a decentralized system, a centralized system, all the images are held in one spot, basically. And if I was to be, I would walk up to maybe a camera, my face would get, my picture would be taken, and it would be compared to this centralized database of millions and millions of images. A decentralized system would be something like what we have on our passports, where there's a digital passport image encoded on the passport. And when I use that, a picture gets taken, the digital image on my passport gets compared to the one that was just taken, and the comparison happens in that way. So that's there's still security risks there, because the passport security, the security on the digital radio device encoded on the passport can have breaches. But then you breach one passport, not all the biometric templates are not in one place, where it's a lot easier to just grab the entire database.
Well, and further to this, images of travelers who are children or elderly are less accurately identified by FRT. In addition to people of ethnic background, that's a really significantly large group of people combined. For this reason, should all travelers once again be able to opt in or opt out of the FRT systems to avoid being misidentified when traveling?
In many jurisdictions at the airports, facial recognition is not applied to travelers under the age of 14 and over the age of 79, I believe, which again greatly undermines any efficiency gains you get from adopting these systems, while subjecting the rest of everybody else to the intrusiveness of having to go through, give up their biometrics. So I think that needs to be taken into account when assessing how effective this is. But it is also a safeguard that has to be in place and taken into account so that these systems are not applied to those age groups where it's known that there's significant drop-offs in accuracy. And for the rest, I think maybe an opt-in is okay, but I do think a moratorium is still a good idea given where things are at in terms of the rapidness of adoption of this technology and the ongoing error and bias problem.
Just following up on that, so you're recommending that there needs to be a moratorium until we know more, and that would seem to definitely be a wise and prudent approach. Whereas a lot of this is emerging technology, the technology is coming in, and the lack of awareness by the Canadian population as a whole as to the ramifications of this type of technology and what it could mean to their privacy rights, their individual rights, and where that information is going to be stored and where that information may get shared. I think there's a lot more questions to this than there are potential benefits from what we're hearing. Thank you.
You're welcome. You did use all of your time and then some, so there isn't time for a response. We will go now to Mr. Baines for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our guests for joining us today. I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Israel. One of the key findings of the report states that FRT has higher levels of social acceptance in comparison to other biometrics. What other biometric technologies is FRT being compared to, and why would FRT be more acceptable than other alternatives?
So I think Ms. Bhandari touched on this as well. So because facial recognition operates surreptitiously and doesn't have associations with things like fingerprinting that were very historically came out of a criminal justice kind of context, there's a bit less, on the one hand, there's a bit less social stigma attached to it in the minds of people, although there shouldn't be because it's increasingly used in the same context with mugshots, et cetera. And then the other part of that is what Ms. Bhandari was talking about before, which is that because it happens remotely and with less direct interference with individuals, sometimes they're just not aware of how intrusive what's happening in comparison to other biometrics where you have to physically, grab people's fingers or scan their eyes in a way where they're like leaning in to make sure that they have an iris scan. So for those two reasons, facial recognition has been easier to get adopted. Thank you.
Okay, and then next question is, how should FRTs be regulated in the private sector? Mr. Israel again.
I think it's I think the harm in the private sector can be even worse in some contexts than in the public sector. There's probably wider variation. I think we recommend empowering the Privacy Commissioner to look into the adoption of intrusive technologies as a specific technology and impose conditions and even moratoria on specific technologies as a meta way of addressing this. And we also recommend encoding biometric information to sensitive and explicitly requiring express consent for biometric information, as is, I believe, the case in the Illinois law, Ms. Bhandari mentioned, and in the Quebec law now. I think those are two good steps. And then perhaps even a moratoria there. It's just a broader use case. So, yeah.
Thank you. To Ms. Bhandari, U.S. police authorities have been much more willing to engage with FRT technology. Sorry, wrong one. So, the state of Illinois has a law that applies specifically to biometrics, the Biometric Information Privacy Act, and therefore to facial recognition technology. What are the benefits of this legislation?
One of the main ones is that it enabled us to hold a company like Clearview accountable for creating a database of hundreds of millions of people's face prints without consent, selling it to private companies and law enforcement for a whole host of purposes. We have been advocating for other states to adopt biometric privacy laws, and in particular make changes, because the Illinois law is at this point quite old, and we have more knowledge about the technology and the risks of the technology. So among the recommendations that we make in the context of states that were to adopt a legislation like the Illinois BIPA, one is clearly requiring companies to obtain notice and written consent before collecting or using or disclosing any person's identifier, and prohibiting companies from withholding services from people who choose not to consent, so that they're not given the choice of accessing a service versus not accessing the service if they're not willing to use or give up their biometrics. We also urge that any legislation require businesses to delete biometric identifiers after 1 year of the individual's last interaction with a business. So for example, if someone gave their biometrics to access a service and consented, but have no longer got a relationship with that business, the business shouldn't be able to hold on to and amass a database of these sensitive biometrics. As Mr. Israel mentioned, there's a risk of breach. We've seen instances of those, and that there's no need for those private entities to hold on to those. So we do advocate adopting legislation like Illinois BIPA, but also updating it.
So are there any modernized laws in other states that Canada could be inspired by?
I would have to think and get back to the committee on whether there's a sort of a perfect model. I think the Illinois law is a good place to start. And I think that there have been proposals in places like Maryland and Maine. Those laws have not been enacted, but they are out there. Those models are available, and we urge their passage. So I would look to Maryland and Maine specifically for models.
Thank you. And how much time do I have?
About two or no, you're done. 0. You had about 3 seconds left. We're now going to go to Monsieur Villemeux pour 2 minutes et demie.
For 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2.5 minutes is a very short period of time. Ms. Bandari, this morning the Canadian government presented a charter, a digital charter. So part of it is on artificial intelligence and data. So we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and facial recognition related to this. So the act or the bill will be sent to various committees so it can be improved. With your experience with the BIPA law, what should we use to inspire ourselves to improve our digital charter, which has just been created?
Point to the committee that the Maryland bill is SB 335, which is a biometric privacy law. So I think that is one model that this committee could look to. There are...
On a très peu de temps, mais dans la loi BIPA, de quoi? De cette loi-là?
So in the BIPA law, what should we inspire ourselves from in this act, BIPA?
Are key. And it has to be meaningful consent. I think Mr. Israel spoke about the downsides of opt-out consent. And particularly one concern we have is that we all interact with so many businesses, particularly online, that if you have to opt out every time, people get opt-out fatigue. So I think affirmative express consent is one thing that should inspire this committee, and meaningful opt-in consent. For particular uses.
D'accord. Est-ce que vous...
Do you believe that it is in European legislation, we could in some way evoke a right to withdraw our images from databases?
Part of any regulation that there should be a sunset period. As I mentioned, we've suggested 1 year after last interaction with a business as a default, but certainly anytime an individual chooses to have their biometrics deleted from a database, that option should remain. And again, recognizing that people may choose to use biometrics for a very specific purpose, even with the risks that entails, but that doesn't give carte blanche to the company to hold on to those because they're so sensitive identifiers and could lead to identity theft and a whole host of other issues.
Dans une loi à venir, on devrait avoir...
In a future law, we should have a clear possibility of being able to withdraw or opt out easily.
A clear limit on any private sector collection of biometrics, any clear limit on sharing with other entities, including law enforcement, without the consent of the individual, and carving a very important regulation so that it's not that once you give up your biometrics for one purpose, it can be shared broadly.
Beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Green for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'd love for the guests to be able to summarize in the final thoughts any information for the good and welfare of this committee, for the consideration of our analysts when drafting a report. So I'll start with Ms. Bandari. If you just want to take a minute and perhaps share any concluding thoughts that you might have that you want the committee to take away from.
My final thoughts are I would urge the committee to act expeditiously. The technology is developing every year, and as things stand, it's a too far unregulated field, which is inflicting harms every day. And there are very concrete, specific laws that can be enacted. There is regulation that can be effective, regardless of what has happened before. So I hope that the committee will keep in mind the very specific recommendations that Mr. Israel provided and others. It's not too late to act.
Important. Mr. Israel, if you'd like to just conclude.
I would second what Ms. Mandari was saying. It's not too late to act. I would just also add really quickly that we have a very big enforcement problem in Canada. So obviously we had rulings against Clearview here as well. Clearview is currently challenging those rulings against it, right? From the BC Privacy Commissioner, the Alberta Privacy Commissioner, and the Quebec Commissioner. Federally, though, it did not challenge the Federal Privacy Commissioner's ruling because that ruling is not binding. And so it could just essentially take it as a recommendation and move on. So I think the enforcement mechanisms that will come through and the private right of action that is coming through the Bill C-27 that I imagine may come before you shortly is something that you would also like to take a look at very closely when you're considering how to make sure that these whatever laws you put in place are respected by Clearview and all the other companies that follow in its model.
Thank you so much to both witnesses. I'm happy to end the rest of my time, Mr. Chair.
Okay, well, that catches us up by about 45 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Green. There are the final two rounds to Mr. Carrick, and then we'll be done with Mr. Fergus. So go ahead, Mr. Carrick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you to the witnesses. Ms. Banderi, you mentioned that there were a couple of exemptions to the Clearview biometrics you had referenced in one of your previous answers. Would you be able to expand on that for the committee?
I'm sorry that I don't have the specifics of those exemptions to provide. They're exemptions that are written into the BIPA law for various specific purposes. So I can point the committee. I can send details to the clerk later on the specifics of the settlement, which outlines what those exceptions in BIPA are.
That would be appreciated. Mr. Israel, you had referenced the WEF's known travel digital identity program, and I've certainly heard from many constituents that are concerned about the idea of a very powerful type of digital ID. The government has entered into or is participating in a pilot program. In that regard, do you have any concerns with the KTDI pilot program that you could outline to the committee, and in particular, if there's any concern about how a program like this may disproportionately affect certain elements of the population, whether it be people of color, racial minorities, young, old, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very concerned. The pilot did get a little bit interrupted by the pandemic, and I don't know how aggressively it's being moved forward now. But I'm very concerned with the idea of using, sort of the pain point of the travel experience to encourage people to opt in and create these types of profiles, knowing that they're then going to be used against them, not just in border control contexts where many marginalized communities are already at a massive disadvantage. Here and abroad in other countries that end up implementing the same system because it's intended to be a global system, but also with the idea that these same systems are going to then be used by the private sector for fraud detection or identity management in interactions with private companies. The facial recognition component of this is a big part because all the errors there are going to, again, fall most heavily on members of invisible minorities and members of marginalized communities. But then the other assessment and social ranking mechanisms that are included in this identity verification program and will sit on your device and be linked to you through your facial recognition also tend to weigh very heavily and disproportionately against members of marginalized communities. So I think this is not the way to go personally.
No, I appreciate that, and if you'd bear with me here, certainly I've heard from constituents who are concerned about the inclusion of one's political beliefs as to whether or not they travel. The inclusion of something like race as to whether or not you're allowed to rent an apartment, or a whole host of hypotheticals that could be included in some nebulous database that exists somewhere in a server that may or may not have human oversight. Certainly, that's something that I think we all need to be very, very careful of. Is that something that you would agree with?
Absolutely. And part of the challenges with this type of system is you're able to implicitly do, by relying on artificial intelligence assessment tools, you're able to implicitly do what you couldn't do directly. So you couldn't necessarily say, I'm not renting to you because you're Indigenous, but then you could adopt an algorithm that's, relies on biased historical data and ends up, coming to that conclusion without the opacity, without the transparency that would let someone challenge that type of decision explicitly. And that's a very big problem when we move towards these types of this broader set of assessment mechanisms. And again, facial recognition is a tool that really allows a lot of implementation of those types of mechanisms. And the KDTI profile has a lot of elements of that built into it. And just
in my few seconds left, you had referenced the public sector, private sector, and I know that Air Canada, KLM, and some airports, which are kind of quasi-private public entities, depending on where they are in the world. These are some of the partners included in this program. Is that of concern to you?
Absolutely, and that's a concern more broadly with facial recognition systems. There's a lot of back and forth where in other jurisdictions, and we anticipate it'll get here eventually, where airlines are incentivized to adopt facial recognition systems for border control reasons, and then they're given some funding even sometimes, and then they use that for their own commercial reasons. There's a lot of really problematic interplay between how the private sector is increasingly picking up a lot of this very sensitive data at the borders. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Israel. And for the last 5 minutes, Mr. Fergus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you, I'd like to really thank these two witnesses. They've been outstanding, and I really do appreciate their insights. For the two witnesses, if you don't know how committees work here on the House of Commons, is that we actually have to read or have to receive written testimony, or we have to receive verbal testimony for us to make recommendations. We have to hear something on the issue before we can go forward on it. So I'd like to take this in a different tact. And Mr. Israel, I'll ask both witnesses this today, but Mr. Israel, in response to Mr. Kirk, you were talking about transparency, or it's the other side of opacity of these FRT systems and how they surreptitiously take pictures and identify people. I guess my question would be, are you aware of, are either of you aware of, a registry of companies that engage in facial recognition technology? Is there a list somewhere of companies or governments that are and agencies of governments that engage in capturing images for the purposes of FRT?
Sorry. I'm not aware of a list. I will say sometimes you get lists in procurement when there's a procurement kind of process, but often you get a number of companies kind of register to sign up for that, but that takes a little bit of investigative work on the public, from journalists to really uncover that, and it's never complete. I would say really briefly that some states, and Ms. Bhandari may know a bit more about this, but maybe not, do actually require data brokers to register, and that might be something to look in connection to these types of companies if we want to get more transparency into exactly what is happening on the ground.
I'm also not aware of any centralized registry. I will note that the United States, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, did a study on facial recognition tools a couple of years ago. It was a widely publicized study which found the bias, the racial bias and accuracy. And in that study, I believe they looked at least 99 commercial facial recognition tools that were sold by companies. And that didn't even include any facial recognition tools from big companies like Apple or Amazon or Facebook. So that's just to give you a sense of the number, but I am not aware of any centralized registry.
The next question would be to the both of you, should there be such a registry for transparency purposes? Ms. Bhandari, let's start with you.
Well, I certainly think that that is an important first step, particularly for enforcement authorities to know who they regulate. Just as in other industries, if you regulate banks, usually the banks are not operating in secret, and you wouldn't know that they're subject to these regulations. As Mr. Israel mentioned, there is a movement of having data brokers register, but it wouldn't necessarily capture companies that sell facial recognition or other algorithmic tools. And requiring that kind of transparency on a product that you sell would allow for, whether there's a private right of action or private enforcement of violations of law or regulation, or whether regulators know who to be monitoring.
Yeah, precisely. So I think that's correct. I think Ms. Bhandari is right that the database list would not capture these types of tools, but perhaps it could be a model to build on. And I would suggest also in the European regime, some types of more intrusive techniques require a privacy impact assessment be filed with the data protection regulator early on in the process. So something along those lines might help. It wouldn't capture necessarily like smaller and early onset tools or all the tools, but it might be another way of getting a window into what's developing earlier on.
Let me see if I can just get one more question in the minute that's left to me. Are you aware of, let's say, the European context with their digital protections, or perhaps any state or sub-national organizations? Do they have a requirement, again, for companies to declare publicly that they're using this or employing this technology? And I'm not just talking about people who sell the service. I'm talking about for companies that might use it only for their own purposes.
There have been some proposed laws in the United States that would require disclosure of algorithmic tools or automated decision making, and I think facial recognition technology would be included in that. But some laws that we have seen actually enacted at the city or state level require transparency for government use. So, for example, if law enforcement is adopting new technology like facial recognition, that transparency is mandated so that there can be democratic community oversight. So, for example, in many cases, city councils didn't even know what their police departments were using, what technology they had. So these laws would mandate that be made public, and then the city councils and other democratic bodies could exercise oversight. So I've seen it in the government use context.
Thank you.
And I think that addition would be great in the Canadian context as well. And then I think also requiring that type of notice to be very...
We're actually significantly over time. I was just, in fact, my microphone wasn't activated, but I was just in the midst of wrapping things up. So I thank you very much to both of our witnesses for their testimony. We got great information today, so thank you very much for that. And with that, meeting adjourned.